right. So we'll keep all the participants muted and the video turned off throughout the presentation just to kind of help minimize distraction. And if everyone could go ahead, as Carol mentioned, and open up your chat box and send us your name and where you're coming from, what city or county, and maybe what kind of invasive plants that you might be dealing with in your community. So that'd be greatly appreciated, so we can kind of get an idea of our demographics here. And yeah, we'll give you a moment to do that and introduce yourselves. Looks like we got a good group, some folks from Rochester Hills, Manistee, Spider Lake. All right. So just a little bit more housekeeping here. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can feel free to just type those right in the chat box. And we've got Ralph who will be taking a peek at that. And if we're able to answer some in the chat box during the presentation, we will do that. But otherwise, we'll just wait until the end and make sure that all those questions get answered by our speaker, Emily. And there will be time at the end of the presentation to ask any remaining questions as well. All right, so before we get started with the main presentation of the day, we just wanted to share a bit of our background and what we do here at the Grand Traverse Conservation District, and then I will hand it off to Carol. So the Grand Traverse Conservation District was established in, sorry, I think I skipped a slide there, established in 1941 and historically was started as a really valuable tool during the Dust Bowl era for farmers to learn better cultivation practices and best management practices. Today, the same idea is still heard throughout our mission, while at the same time, it's also been expanded to include a really wide range of programming, including our Boardman River Nature Center, in order to instill and promote the idea of conservation into all generations. We were previously an unfunded entity until 2018, when the people of Grand Traverse County voted to give us a millage, which has helped us tremendously in our day-to-day operations and our ability to serve our community. And so we really are truly blessed to have our district offices housed at the Boardman River Nature Center on Grand Traverse County's Natural Education Reserve property. This is where most of our work stems from, housing my program, MEEP, also Emily's program, ISN, the Invasive Species Network, our Parklands programs, and some other programs. Our education department operates almost exclusively from the Nature Center, which includes camps and field trips for area youth to partake in and indulge themselves in nature and conservation by utilizing the several miles of trails that we have located directly behind the Nature Center and right along the Boardman River. Some of the things that we do in line with our mission is restoration through management of those invasive species with our Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, instilling and fostering exploration of the natural world through our Parklands program and education program. The Parklands program features 3,000 acres of public parklands throughout the county. And we also provide technical assistance to agricultural producers in Northwest Michigan through MEEP, primarily by working with these farms to mitigate and prevent environmental risks. Another facet of our work is restoration and stewardship of the Boardman River bottomlands and its associated watershed. Following the removal of, I'm sure you guys have heard, several hydroelectric dams. We also have a district forester, Kama Ross, who works through the Forestry Assistance Program to provide assistance for private landowners on woodland ownership. All right. So there are a few ways that the community can get involved with our work and mission, such as volunteering at the Nature Center as a docent, a trail steward, with our seedling and native plant sales, or in other capacities, simply promoting sustainable and responsible enjoyment of the outdoors, or participating in upcoming district events and programs, all of which can be found on our website under events and are currently subject to change in venue, just in light of COVID, some things being held over Zoom as we are today. Another way to become involved is to sign up as a trail steward. These are our eyes and ears on the trails that report downed trees, erosion issues, and other parkland concerns. And lastly, just consider donating and supporting to GTCD on our website, or becoming a friend of the district by visiting natureiscalling.org/support that you can see on the bottom of the screen there. All right, so thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Carol Kusel with Protecting Our Lakes and Shorelines, and she will launch us into today's presentation. So Carol, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren, for sharing all the good work that the Grand Traverse Conservation District staff does. There sure is a lot, and we appreciate you all. Welcome, everyone, to the third and last webinar of the Protecting Our Lakes and Shorelands 2021 series. My co-organizers and fellow riparians, Patty Herzberger, she's with us today, you'll hear from her later, and Ralph Bednars, he's with us today as a participant, along with me, are glad you chose to join us today. Over 120 people registered for today's webinar. Many are here with us on the screen or virtually, and others, well, I suspect they want to get the follow-up email that includes the link to the recording of this webinar, and then plan to watch it later. We sure hope they do, and we hope many other people watch it too. This poll series began 3 years ago as an in-person presentation. As relatively new riparians, Patty and I decided we wanted to learn more about our lake ecosystems and how we could protect our beloved lake, both individually and collectively. We quickly learned that others wanted to learn the same information. 2 years ago, Ralph joined us and we teamed up with the Grand Traverse Conservation District, moving our local presentations to virtual webinars, and thus expanded our audience base throughout Michigan and beyond. Michigan is blessed with many professionals who specialize in supporting our lakes, streams, shorelines, and shorelands. Shorelands, that's the land above the shorelines or above the water, including the shorelines. We, the polls team, have enjoyed connecting with some of those dedicated Michigan professionals for the polls series over the last 3 years. Today, we're excited to have Emily Cook join us. She has a degree in natural resources management from Grand Valley State University and has been working as the outreach specialist for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network since 2015. However, she's been working in conservation for the last 13 years and held positions with the Nature Conservancy, the National Park Service, AmeriCorps, and several small nonprofit organizations. When not educating us in Northwest Michigan and beyond about invasive species, she can be found exploring the outdoors with her husband and their 2 dogs, or spending time in their garden. And although Emily didn't include it in her bio, I'll add that her sketchings or her artwork is particularly beautiful. Hope you get the opportunity to see it sometime. Today, Emily will help us learn to properly identify, remove, and dispose of several common shoreline invasive plants. Additionally, she will suggest several native plants that thrive in shoreline environments. I'm sure, I'll bet, we'll all learn a great deal from her. And we, the polls team, all hope you leave this webinar with a renewed energy to become a better steward of the water and land near you. Emily, I pass the baton.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that introduction. Can I get a thumbs up from the polls crew or Lauren that my screen looks like it's supposed to? I'm obviously very concerned about that. Thank you. So I'm going to dive right in. My name is Emily. Like Carol said, I'm the outreach specialist for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, which is a bit of a mouthful. So before I dive into today's topic, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what we do as an organization. And then I'll be covering the really, the basics about an invasive species. What is an invasive species? Because I think that's always pretty important to talk about before you dive into the nitty gritty of plants specifically. There's plants and animals, but today we'll just be talking about plants. So the Invasive Species Network, and I'll just refer to it as ISN from this point out for the sake of ease, but we're a collaboration of over 60 partners ranging from individuals all the way up to federal partners. So some of our main ones are pictured right here. All of the conservation districts in our service area. Our service area is Benzie, Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Manistee County. So this little corner of Northwest Michigan. Feeling very fortunate to work where we do. It's absolutely beautiful. But then we work with folks like the DNR, the Forest Service, our various tribal units, and the other land conservancies. So a lot of really great, talented natural resources professionals who all have a say in some of the work we do with invasive species management. We do a variety of things within ISN. So we run a program called Go Beyond Beauty, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But basically, there are a lot of invasive species still sold, and that obviously becomes quite an issue from a management perspective when you're trying to remove a landscape of invasive species and people can still go out and buy them. So this is a program that works with garden professionals to remove those plants from sale, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. We do direct treatment of invasive species, of the high priority species that are in high quality habitats, and some of our main ones are listed there, but things like Japanese knotweed, Phragmites, garlic mustard, which I'm sure no matter where you live along a shoreline or terrestrial, you have experience with that. And then we also focus on the species that aren't quite here yet. We're keeping an eye out for them. We're conducting surveys for them, or maybe there's only a very small population that we're trying to target. I'll show a graph in a moment that depicts why it's so critical to get species early if you can, and that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're targeting your own invasive species on your own property and your own communities. So trying to get ahead of some of these outbreaks before they get too big to manage. We work with the public a lot, so working with volunteers, getting folks out to do work bees and get that hands-on experience of how to remove certain invasive species. We focus on a couple of different ones, primarily garlic mustard and baby's breath. There's a lot of invasives that are pretty tricky to remove and they're not very volunteer friendly. So we try and use the ones that have a clear removal method. But you can see there's a baby's breath work bee picture at the bottom of that slide, and then some public presentations that were given. The pictures on the right of the before and after, that's of a Japanese knotweed treatment in Manistee County. The road side was completely, both sides was almost 100% Japanese knotweed, and that was treated over a few years. It was a successful management program for that. And finally, we do a lot of outreach. That's my job, talking to anyone who will sit still about invasive species and why they're important, why you should care about them, talking about the value of habitat, and I talk to kindergarten classrooms about monarch butterflies, and then I'll also talk to road commissions and local governments about ordinances. It's really a topic that can be relatable to many different groups. So the kind of mantra of ISN is Habitat Matters. It's also our website if you're curious and learning more. It's habitatmatters.org. But we do the work we do because we care about preserving habitat. From kind of I don't want to say selfish, but from a personal perspective, we care about habitat because we enjoy recreating in Northwest Michigan. I just saw there were some folks that aren't from this area, but no matter what, if you enjoy getting out in nature and seeing a diverse landscape with different types of plants and different insects and a variety of birds, that's why we're trying to maintain habitat. We care about habitat because it's part of the economy, whether we like it or not. Creating healthy forests that are managed sustainably is a big deal. And where we're from in Northwest Michigan, it is a little busy in the summertime, but a ton of tourism aiding our economy because people want to go to Sleeping Bear Dunes. They want to go for hikes and see our spring ephemerals and go swimming in our incredible lakes and have access to those lakes without, a swath of invasive species blocking them. And so that's one of the reasons we do what we do. And then also I put the biggest picture here as a family of birds or a mother robin feeding her birds, because so many studies have been done showing that invasive species, especially when compared to native plants, they just don't have a big role in our food web. They're not supporting the same number of insects that our native plants do. Our insects evolved to alongside these native plants, and an invasive species comes in and starts to push out these native plants, and suddenly we have fewer insects, and those insects are feeding a clutch of baby birds. And you can really start to see that connection appear. These are just two images I always like to put into my presentations. They're kind of the poster children for habitat and management of invasive species and the promotion of native species. But of course, the monarch butterfly, like I said, I can bring this up to any group and they'll know the connection between monarch caterpillars and eating milkweed. It's their one food source of the milkweed plants. And there's a variety of species. But it's nice to have such a clear message defined by these really incredible butterflies. Certainly not the only species that relies on one or two native plants as a food source, but definitely the most well-known, I would think. And then of course, maybe a little less popular, but even more important are our bees. I took this picture of a bumblebee at the Boardman River Nature Center a few years ago, perched on a sneezeweed, which is a really beneficial native plant. And just letting them have that habitat to thrive and pollinate is so critical. Really quickly, I'm going to go over what an invasive species is, just so we're all on the same page. So an invasive species is something that's not native. So it's not from here, wherever you may be. And depending on where you live, you might have different invasive species than we do. There are some plants and animals that are more invasive in southern Michigan than northern Michigan. Other parts of the country have their own things they're dealing with that we don't have. But it has to be from another part of the world. In introduction, it can be intentional or accidental. It doesn't have to be one or the other. There's few natural predators, so there's very little keeping it in check. So where the plant comes from, maybe there's an insect that eats it, or a common disease that'll wipe it out, or seasonal changes that knock it back. But often invasive species, when they're introduced to a new area, do not have that relationship with things that will eat it or make it so it's less prolific. And often we find that invasive plants in at least our region, deer won't even eat. And if you garden at all, you'll know that they will touch just about every native plant and impact just about every native garden. And so that's a concern, is that they're getting pushed out and they have this increase in predation because the deer won't eat the invasive species. And also finally, just massive seed production. So the ability to spread so much. So I put in a picture of invasive honeysuckle. That's one most people would be able to identify, covered in berries, moved by people, often by birds, and can really quickly take you over an area because of that. The formal definition of an invasive species is a non-native species that harms people, the environment, or the economy. It's a very textbook definition, but it works well. It's a good way to separate plants from others. I often get the question, well, is poison ivy an invasive species? Well, it harms people. You know, I'm terribly allergic to poison ivy, but it's not a non-native species. It's from here. It's a native plant, and so it's not an invasive species. And we always tell people they can manage it how they want, but it's not something we're going to be targeting. And when we talk about invasive species and management, and I want you to keep this in mind as I talk about the shoreline species in just a moment, it's really critical to try and get them managed really as soon as you can. I think it's really easy to say, oh, there's only a couple of them, we'll deal with it next year. But that can really quickly get out of hand, and then you run into a situation that's very, very difficult to manage. So if you look at this graph, we try and manage towards the left side of that graph. So either something's just introduced, maybe there's a single population, maybe even a single plant. We've had that before where we found a single invasive species, the first one in our area, and we've been able to get it. Or the detection area of that graph. There's a few locations, still not too expensive to manage. It's still, we have the human power to go out and take care of it. It's when you get to the right side of that graph where there's plants, you know, the invasive plant you're targeting everywhere, where it becomes really, really challenging to have successful management. Either it's just impossible to get every plant, it's expensive, you don't have the resources to manage them. That's where it gets pretty challenging. And so I put up a picture of a purple loosestrife here because that's one of the ones I'll be highlighting in my talk. If you have just a single purple loosestrife, it's pretty easy to get rid of that. There are some methods for managing it that I'll be talking about. I won't say it's a one and done because it almost never is with an invasive species. It requires follow-up treatment, but it won't consume your whole life, that kind of thing. It's when you get to a situation like this. So this is purple loosestrife, where I would classify on the right side of that graph, where that entire wetland, all you see is purple loosestrife. And it's beautiful. I'll be the first to admit that the purple of purple loosestrife is pretty stunning. We don't have a lot of wildflowers like that. But if you look closer, there's nothing else growing in that environment. It's just purple loosestrife. They're not supporting the insects that we need for a diverse habitat. And then if you did manage to get rid of all of that, you have a huge restoration project on your hands. A lot of times what comes in after a big invasive species removal are other invasive species. So you're going to have, you know, years of management. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, but it's just very realistic that if you're able to, you know, manage a couple of invasive species before it gets to this point, that's definitely recommended. And my last slide before we dive into shorelines, how do they get here? So like I said earlier, many times they're just imported accidentally. Invasive Phragmites is an example of this. It was introduced, they're not entirely sure when, late 18th century, early 19th century, possibly in ship ballasts. A lot of plants are introduced to the East Coast and then gradually work their way towards us and across North America. Some are imported for food or medicine. Garlic mustard's a perfect example of this. You can eat the entire plant, roots and flowers and leaves, many people do. And then other food sources were discovered and they were allowed to escape cultivation. Many plants, and I talked about this briefly and I will again later, are introduced and imported for gardens, for landscaping. And before their invasiveness is realized, or even if their invasiveness is realized, people still desire them for certain reasons. So buckthorns, Japanese barberry, calorie pear. Those are some of the priorities on our list that you could still go out and purchase. And other ones, and I hate to bring this plant up because it's just awful and it's got a torrid history, but autumn olive, you know, there are some plants out there that were huge conservation oops, and many people are dealing with them today. Autumn olive was introduced by conservation groups actually for wildlife habitat and to manage soil erosion, and their invasive qualities were not completely understood and realized, and then they spread very, very rapidly, and now all over the Midwest, you'll see them taking over huge areas. All right, so now I'm going to dive into the core of the presentation. Thanks for bearing with me. I always want to clarify what an invasive species is when I'm about to talk about them and managing them. So I'll be talking about a few priority species, how to manage them. I'll be doing a quick overview of a few others I think it's important to be aware of, and then we'll be reviewing some disposal options for the invasive plants as well. So I talked about this one briefly, but I do want to focus on purple loosestrife first because it is one that many people are aware of and many people are dealing with, and it can be a bit tricky to manage. And it gets overwhelming, which I understand. So purple loosestrife obviously has those bright purple blooms, and it's actually illegal to sell, trade, plant, or share in Michigan. And so I don't want this to be alarming if you weren't aware of this law. It doesn't mean if you have it growing on your property that you're suddenly doing something illegal. That's not what this means. It just means it's illegal to dig up the plant and give it to your neighbor who doesn't have purple loosestrife but likes that pretty flower that's in your yard. That's what that law means. It forms a really dense monoculture in areas. So you can see from that picture in the background that if purple loosestrife takes over, it grows really close together. It starts pushing out those native plants, minimizing that diverse habitat. It also grows a lot faster than other wetland plants. So say there are some natives growing there, its ability to grow faster will actually start to shade out some of those lower growing species. It has the possible, it can grow up to 10 feet tall. I haven't seen any that tall, but they can shoot those flowery stalks up quite high. And you can see how a native plant growing underneath would start to struggle. Another thing is it has a really, if you're familiar with purple loosestrife, you'll know this. And if you're not, it has a really thick, stiff stalk. The stem is quite thick. And when it's in an aquatic area, it'll actually start catching sediment in the soil in the area, and that will build up on that stalk. And over time, it can actually dry up shallow water habitat. So it can turn an area that was more aquatic based into something that's more terrestrial. And that alone can really affect what is trying to grow there, what beneficial plants are trying to go there, what insects are going to be found in that area. It'll minimize habitat for waterfowl. And then from a personal viewpoint, or many of you who have an interest in this subject, if you live on a shoreline and you've got purple loosestrife really densely along your shoreline, your access to that water is going to be minimized as well. So it's important to get it out if you can. So I mentioned the height there. The leaf shape can vary quite a bit, but the leaves are always going to be opposite from each other. So if you're not sure what that means, it means that on the stem of the plant, the leaves are going to be directly across from each other. Otherwise, it would be alternate leaves. So it'd be, one up and one below, but they'll be opposite. They have really, really complex root systems, which make them challenging to remove if you're going the digging route. Carol, this is a picture Carol provided to me, the one on the right, of some root systems of the purple loosestrife. And you can see that it's really, really dense, and they have these rhizomes that go out, and that's one of the way it spreads. And it's very physical to remove purple loosestrife, just to be totally transparent. And so that's something to be prepared for if you go that route. And it is blooming right now. I'm sure most of you are very aware of that. It'll bloom through the rest of the summer. I've seen it all along ponds and roadside ditches. It thrives where it's going to have that shallow water habitat. So if you're managing purple loosestrife, there's a few actually different routes you can go. So like I said, you can go the mechanical removal route, which is the digging up of the plants. You have to be really careful to try and get as much of the root system as possible, and that's where it gets hard, because they will create new, if you don't get all of the roots, a new plant will grow. This would be a good method potentially if you have just a few plants or one plant, or just a couple that you could tackle. If it's a really, really dense area and they're all growing together, mechanical removal probably wouldn't be the best option. There are some really great tools available if you're going this route. The shovels pictured on the tool picture on the left-hand side, these are a lot of shovels we use for these kinds of removals, and they're called root slayers. It's by a company called Radius Garden. They were donated to our group by an individual who designed them specifically to help manage invasive species. They're very long and they have a really sharp end. They have kind of saw blades on the side, and they've been extremely beneficial. So we recommend something like that if you're going to tackle this type of removal. Another thing you can do that's really simple if you have just a couple is you can actually snip off the flower heads of purple loosestrife before they go to seed and drop them in a plastic bag, tie them up and dispose of them that way. It won't necessarily kill the plant right away, but you're preventing new seeds from spreading, which is important, and gradually it will help knock back the plant, but that's going to be a really gradual treatment option. For very large populations of purple loosestrife, there is actually a biocontrol option. So a biocontrol is the introduction of another biological agent to control something. This has backfired a lot historically. I'll be the first to say you have to be so careful introducing another species to manage a species you don't necessarily want. But in the case of purple loosestrife beetles, they are very successful. A lot of research was done into them to make sure they would eat only what land managers wanted them to eat, and they do. And so if you have a large population of loosestrife, and this is what we do when we're managing them, you can see a picture, the two pictures with individuals in them with the bags. Those are actually, if you buy the beetles, they come on purple loosestrife plant that's covered in netting, and then you basically set it into a population and they will start munching away. Now, this will not eradicate the purple loosestrife, but it will knock it way back over several years. In invasive species management, we typically don't eradicate anything, rarely. Sometimes we don't like to use that word, but it can become a lot better managed, and that is the goal. Chemical treatments are also an option for removing, and they are for many invasive species. It depends on your comfort level with using an herbicide. Of course, always consider where you are spraying, especially we're talking about shorelines, and needing to take into consideration that herbicides need to be aquatic approved and safe for the fish and the insects and everything in that area, and other plants even. So if you have any herbicide questions, I unfortunately am not the one to answer those. I have some herbicide knowledge, but we also have a management side of ISN that does that every day. They're very well educated in that, and they would be the folks to reach out to, and I can certainly guide you to them if you would like. So there's a couple purple loosestrife lookalikes out there, and that's something that you need to think about before you manage, to make sure you absolutely have purple loosestrife. If you're not sure, you can send somebody, including myself, a picture and say, hey, I think this is loosestrife. Can you let me know? And we can say yes or no, and you can go from there if you want to confirm before diving into treatment. But there's some pictures of a few plants that you could have growing that are not purple loosestrife, but look a little similar. So marsh blazing star is one, blue vervain, and then we actually have our native swamp loosestrife. But if you look at the swamp loosestrife on that right picture, pay attention to where those blooms are. They're very much oriented on where those leaves come together. And I'm going to go back to the other picture here. And it's a little small, but that middle picture of the purple invasive purple loosestrife, you can see that those flowers are all the way up that stalk. And so that's the difference, one of the main things you can look for when it's blooming. It's also just not as vivid of a purple, the swamp loosestrife. Some other things you could replace purple loosestrife with if you're looking to incorporate more habitat. Joe Pyeweed is a wonderful one. It's blooming right now. Another kind of deep purple bloom. Swamp milkweed, cardinal flower, not purple, but bright red. There's a lot of really wonderful native plants to consider in grasses and sedges as well. Really, buffing up that shoreline and making it diverse. Consider adding some of those native plants. So switching gears, I'm going to dive into yellow flag iris. So this is a species that, like Carol said, I've been with the Invasive Species Network since 2015, and it's really only been in the last 3 to 4 years that I started getting a lot more phone calls and emails about this plant. It's been around for a while, it's been invasive for a while, but it's really in recent years started to spread quite a bit more. And starting to take over these shorelands. So sometimes it's called pale yellow iris. I don't hear that term often. Usually it's just yellow flag iris. And it's originally native to Europe. Many of our invasive species are like the Eurasia region when they come where they're originally from. And so these are going to be found in very similar ecosystems, lakes, ponds, streams, and typically not more than a foot of water. The figure I found was up to 10 inches deep, and that reflects what I've seen them, where I've seen them growing, but I'm sure that can vary. It looks very much like your standard iris that you'd be familiar with, except it's this bright yellow, very easy to spot when it's blooming. Those really narrow leaves that would shoot up, it's pretty recognizable, those leaves, even when it's not blooming, but that can make it hard to identify from some of our native species when the blooms are missing. And it does bloom a little earlier in the season, typically May through June. So right now is not when you're going to be spotting those. So like purple loosestrife, yellow flag iris is kind of a beast to dig out. Again, Carol can attest to this. But you can do it if you've got some willpower and some patience. It has been shown to be effective, especially if you have a shovel, regardless of the brand. I just plugged that one because that's what we use. But if you have a long, sharp spade, you can get them out. But again, it's going to be detailed work. And you have to go after those really complex rhizomes, and you can see the little bulbs that are, come with irises, no matter what you're working with. Also, an aquatic approved herbicide, they've been found to be successful with the yellow flag iris as well. So if that's a route you're comfortable with, again, you can reach out to us for more information. We'd be happy to guide you on that. Wanted to put in this graphic really quickly. So we have a native iris, the blue flag iris, and obviously when it's blooming, you can tell them apart. One's yellow and one's blue. There's no mistaking that. We do have a non-native German bearded iris there in the middle, a little more pale yellow, supports some pollinators, but not a lot. It doesn't play a really big role in our food web. But it's not invasive. It's not going to take over like the yellow flag. It's identifying between the yellow flag iris and the blue flag iris when it's not blooming. That can be quite tricky and affect management a bit. And if you're just going to wait to see when it blooms, which is which, that's one way to approach it. Another way you can tell is you have to look closely, but these are the seed capsules of the iris. So, excuse me, quick drink here. So on the left, there are the seed capsules of the blue flag iris. The middle picture is of the yellow invasive flag iris. It's a little hard to tell from these pictures, but in the yellow flag iris, it's going to have 6 angled sides basically to that seed pod. You crack it open and you'll have the 6 different angles really clear. The blue flag iris capsules only have 3. And so if you're later in the season, these are out already, that's one way you can distinguish, like, okay, I see the leaves, those clearly iris, but which is which? You could look at those seed capsules to tell them apart. Otherwise, obviously, like I said, the bloom color is the major indicator. If you've got that blue flag iris, that's a really beneficial, incredible wetland plant that should be left to thrive there. If you're looking to replace yellow flag iris, or you like the yellow in a wetland, some other things to consider are blue vervain, not yellow, but marsh marigold is a bright yellow that you could incorporate into your landscape. Sneezeweed, that picture of the bee earlier was on a sneezeweed. And then again, not yellow, but a nice plant that likes wet feed is the rose mallow, something with really incredible large blooms, something to consider. So the third species to highlight is moneywort. And I want to thank the Spider Lake folks for taking a lot of these pictures, because I did not have a lot of great pictures of moneywort. But sometimes called creeping Jenny. In fact, I often hear it referred to creeping Jenny, maybe even more than moneywort. Native to Europe and West Asia, like many are found, many invasive species rather. This one is interesting because it's a ground cover, and we don't have a lot of aquatic ground covers, or more of those transitional species that are ground covers. And they can be really finicky. And this one has been starting to show up at a lot of boat launches, which is interesting. So if you're launching a boat and you look off to the side, you might start to see moneywort or creeping Jenny. And that's a little concerning. It's getting spread, and there's clearly an avenue of why it's spreading. So like most ground covers, it forms these really dense mats across the surface of the soil. Not very high, just a couple of inches. It has these really round leaves, so it's got some blooms there. But if you're looking for kind of a vine, a creepy vine, maybe creepy, but creeping vine along the surface with those almost spoon-shaped leaves, that's a good bet that it's the moneywort. And another thing about this one is this is one you'll spot still for sale often in the ground cover section. And it's important to point that out. It's very common in like a display, a pot you might put on a porch or on a deck or something, because it has those tendrils that kind of go down. It's often added to those. And then those pots get thrown out or, dumped somewhere, and then it's really easy for the plant to take over. Hand pulling, unfortunately, is pretty much the only recommended method for getting rid of moneywort at this point. No herbicides have been found at this point to be effective. It's not a lot of research has been done on this because it's another plant that's been starting to take over a bit more recently. But with some perseverance, getting in and getting those roots, you can see some of the roots shown there. It is possible to manage it. The other cool thing that some research has been done about is incorporating native plants to shade it out if possible. So there's some invasive species that you can actually push out with natives if you incorporate the correct ones. Grasses, ferns, that sort of thing, other herbaceous species. I put grasses in there primarily because I think they're some of the more resilient native plants, grasses and sedges. They have really their own really incredible root systems that might be able to beat a species like moneywort. So another thing to consider if you're looking, like I just couldn't possibly dig out all of these roots, you could consider doing a little bit of a restoration sooner rather than later and putting in some of those native plants. So I am running a little bit out of time. I have a few more minutes. So I'm going to go a little quickly through these last slides because I did cover the main ones I wanted to. but I see that I still have maybe 5 or 6 minutes, so I'll keep going here before questions. Most people, I would have to assume, are familiar with Phragmites, another plant that's illegal to sell, trade, plant, or share in Michigan. And this one just clogs wetlands. It's the best word to use. It grows really tall, up to a dozen feet or taller. You can see in the picture there, just towering over the woman that's standing there. So if you're trying to develop a diverse habitat, nothing else is going to grow there. If you're trying to access your lake, launch a kayak or a boat and there's Phragmites, it's really, really hard. It's got really dense stalks that go up, and it's pretty difficult to manage, and it destroys that fish and waterfowl habitat that would be along the shoreline. Really quite obvious to identify from the puffy seed head. We do have a native Phragmites. That's something I do want to point out. It looks very similar. It's generally less robust. That's the best way to put it. You can Google invasive versus native Phragmites and some pictures will come up, but just a little smaller. You don't see it pushing out as much, doesn't grow as densely, and that seed head is a little bit more wispy than the invasive Phragmites. Most commonly, this is one ISN actively treats. We typically do an herbicide treatment on these. We'll do some hand swiping, and so we put herbicide on a gloved hand and swipe the stalks to kill the plant. Makes it very targeted that way. In recent years, what's been interesting is some of the high water that we've had has managed some of the populations for us. Phragmites, even though it likes the water, doesn't like too much water. So some of the high water has actually stunted the growth of some populations, which has been really beneficial these last few years. I know generally high water has not been beneficial for many, but in our perspective for this particular situation, it's been good. Invasive knotweeds. So knotweeds, typically, they're not specific to shoreline areas. They can grow quite happily in many different soil types, many different water. The saturation of the soil can vary greatly. But I wanted to throw this in because it can grow along shorelines, and when it does, it can be, have a pretty big impact, much like the Phragmites. It gets very, very big. It'll grow kind of over the shoreline, affecting that habitat, the fish that would try and hug the shoreline. The other thing with knotweed is that it evolved to grow through hardened lava. So the root system is just incredible. It can grow through concrete and asphalt. So if you have this near your home, or say a dock or a launch or something, it's really no issue for these roots to grow up through that and start causing quite a few issues. There's actually 3 different kinds of knotweed in the area: Japanese, giant, and bohemian. The bohemian is a hybrid between Japanese and giant, and we're finding that most of the knotweed we're dealing with regionally is that hybrid bohemian variety. So instead of saying Japanese knotweed, although we still do out of habit, we're mostly, just saying knotweeds at this point because it's that hybrid. Has really large leaves. I think many of you have seen this. It's often called Michigan bamboo because it looks a lot like bamboo. And again, this is one that we treat directly. It spreads very, very easily. And so we often recommend professional treatment if you have this on your property, and pay attention if it's on your shoreline because it does like to take over. And I apologize, I have a little tickle. All right, just a few more slides here. Just throwing these in because I think there are other ones to really be aware of, some other water-loving species that are going to be on the shorelines to look out for. And all of these, if you're looking at ISN service area, Benzie, Manistee, Grand Traverse, and Leland, all of these except flowering rush are present in this area. So that's something to think about. If you think you spot them, it's not like it's necessarily unusual, but we'd like to know about them. Flowering rush at the bottom there is in Michigan. It's in southern Michigan. There's quite a lot around like Lake St. Clair, up to Saginaw, bay, but not really so much in our area, but it's one we really, really don't want to get. Invasive thistles, butterbur, and coltsfoot are some others to look out for. And I'm going to try, I have 4 slides left. I'll go quickly here. Because I did, the most important thing I wanted to talk about was how to dispose of some of these invasive species if you are managing them. So the priority, of course, is identifying what invasive species you have and making sure you know what it is, because the disposal method is going to vary depending on what invasive species you are dealing with. You really need to follow state and local guidelines. There are local guidelines different from state guidelines. The state guidelines vary depending on which state you're in, so it's important to know what that is. I put a Michigan law up there on the right for you to read. This is the law that allows organizations involved with invasive species removal like ISN to legally dispose of plants. So when we're doing garlic mustard removals or baby's breath or whatever it might be, we can dispose of those legally. And so often you can coordinate with your local invasive species management area, that SISMA, and help get those things disposed. You can also typically just double bag the species that you have and put them out with your roadside garbage as long as they are labeled invasive species. Normally yard waste is not accepted, but invasive species typically will be if they are properly contained, even apart from working with a group like ISN. And also making sure, this is a little bit of a sidetrack from disposal, but making sure that when you are about to go in a lake or out of a lake, that you're disposing of any aquatic plants or whatever's in your tire treads, whatever it might be, before you go to another place. That's just Michigan law, and it's really good practice to help prevent the spread of some of these things. And another thing, one of the things I'm going to finish on is just preventing the spread of these invasive species is one of the most important things you can do for your shorelands. Many of you already have a lot of the plants I was talking about, but preventing the introduction of new ones, preventing the spread of the ones you have to another area is so critical. So a lot of things we can't control. We can't control birds eating berries or seeds. We can't control the wind or the water moving things, but we can control what gets in our tire treads. We can control what seeds get stuck to our pets, in our shoes, and also, like I said, just cleaning those boats off as well as you can. In a lot of areas, we have several mobile boat washing units in the region, and there are operations throughout the state that help with that. And finally, this information is all on the website, so I won't focus on it too much, but that Go Beyond Beauty program I talked about early on, I just really encourage you, when you're shopping for plants for your own landscapes, to consider what you're walking out with. Most of the species I talked about, I think excluding Phragmites, maybe all of them, were introduced as ornamentals at one point. They were brought here because people wanted them in their gardens, and now we're dealing with the side effects of that. So just being educated about what plants are invasive. Many are still sold, and that's the problem. You can go to our website, habitatmatters.org. You can see a list, you can get plant lists of invasive species, and you can also see all the local businesses that participate, and you can feel confident you're working with some folks who won't sell you invasive species. And on that note, I know I went a little over, I apologize, but we do have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. That was incredibly informative. We did have a few questions come through, and if folks think of any now, feel free to type those into the chat box, but I'll kind of just go back here on some things that came through. One thing I just wanted to double check with you, Emily, that this was correct, but Lillian had shared that as she was driving yesterday, she noticed a few large areas on the side of the road that were filled with purple loosestrife. And am I right in you guys have some tools for reporting and such on the Habitat Matters website? And I think I got the link correct, but it's shared in the chat box, habitatmatters.org/ID-and-reporting-tools.
Yeah, that's one way to get to it. And thank you for bringing up reporting. I didn't put that in this presentation, but it's a really good point. that if you have any of these species, there is, you can get routed to a reporting tool from our website, but also the Michigan Invasive Species Information Network, so MISIN, and I can, you know, I can make sure that's included in the follow-up email that goes out with the presentation and whatnot. But that's the main tool we use, and that's what you would get routed to through the website. But it's a huge database, and you can put in your plant that you've spotted, and that information all comes back to invasive species managers. So we get a little alert if something's reported. We don't get alerts for every single species because there's a lot of reporting happening, but we do check it periodically to see where the purple loosestrife is, where the iris is, that sort of thing. If it's a brand new species, that we have little notifications we can set, say someone thinks they found flowering rush, we get a direct alert to our email saying that someone found that, and we can try and manage it sooner rather than later. So, yeah.
Thanks. Another question that came in while you were talking about purple loosestrife was, are the beetles that are released for biocontrol there, are they able to reproduce?
That's a really good question. So typically the beetles are only there for one season. They eat to their heart's delight and then they die. That's one of the reasons they're super successful. So, you know, one thing I mentioned is that we do have to introduce beetles kind of annually for these large areas. So, you know, if 1 year you put a pot of beetles out, you have to know that the next year you'll probably have to do the same. And each year there'll be fewer plants to target, essentially. If folks are interested in the beetles and learning more, I have some information I can provide. We do a bulk order of beetles for ourselves, the work we do, and partners. Usually early spring, I'd have to double check on that. But if that is something people are interested in, we can help coordinate that.
Thanks, Emily. So this one, and maybe it's something that you could add into your follow-up email as well, but sharing again the name of the company that manufactures the weed slayer shovels and tools for folks that might be wanting to purchase them.
Yeah, so I can share that in the follow-up as well, but it's called Radius Garden Supply. And they're based out of, I believe, Ann Arbor. And I've started spotting their tools in many garden centers and that sort of thing, but Radius Garden Supply, and you can get everything, I think, right on their website, but I can send that in a follow-up for sure.
Awesome. And someone else had mentioned that unfortunately that they had purchased yellow flag iris from a local nursery many years ago, but they at the time didn't know that it was probably an invasive. And I think she spoke with both you and Katie. But and you guys have provided some great advice, she said, but all that she can think of to do now is clip the blooms, since there is no way that she can really get into the pond. Do you think that that will work as a good form of management?
Oh, that's a good question. And, you know, that's something I might have to follow up on, because I'm not as familiar with some plants like Loosestrife, for example, that will work. But I can't say for certainty that it will with iris. So if I can get, you know, since we've communicated in the past, I apologize, I can't see like names or anything in this format, but if they want to send me an email or give me a call, I'd like to follow up on that, because I want to make sure that that could be an option. That's
good. And I can share with you, Emily, who shared that question.
Yeah,
it's all visible in the chat. It's Lillian Mahaney. Hope you don't mind.
Oh,
Lillian.
okay, that's Lil. I know. Okay, I know.
Yeah,
Lil,
so you know her.
I'll reach out to her.
All right. The next question that we have is, how do we distinguish the leaves of yellow flag iris from the leaves of cattails?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So typically it's going to be, they do look very similar, but the irises are going to be much shorter. That's the main thing. The irises are only going to be, 2 to 3 feet tall, and typically cattail are, oh gosh, 4 to 5 feet tall typically. And so the height's the main way you're going to tell. Especially cattail will often have that stalk that we're so familiar with along with it that the iris will not have. It's interesting to bring up cattails though, because that's something I didn't talk about, and we do have an invasive cattail that folks should be aware of. There's the narrow-leaved cattail, which is invasive, and then we have our common ones. And so the main thing is to look for the height difference between the iris and the cattail. But if you also have cattail concerns, that's something that we can help with identification, whether it's between cattails or between cattail and iris. We're happy to help with that.
Awesome. So just a couple more questions I think we might have a little bit of time for, but what do you know about the control of mugwort? It's spread along Patty's shoreline and spreading to areas around the house and native gardens.
My knowledge of mugwort is a little limited. We haven't done a lot with that. It's interesting. I'm wondering if this is one that's becoming more prevalent recently, because I've had a couple questions about this year. Pulling mugwort has been successful for some. Others have done smothering. If you have a particularly large swath of mugwort, there's been some success with just smothering the plant. I believe general use herbicides work for those as well. Again, how comfortable people are varies greatly. But like a lot of these other invasives, pulling is an okay route, as long as you're trying, able to get as much of those roots out as possible.
And just 2 more questions here.
Okay.
So someone is having some trouble getting support for Phragmites mitigation using the commonly used herbicide. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the situation a little bit. That's not an uncommon thing. Say it's a lake association and they're trying to get everyone on board. We often have done presentations for the lake association where we will break down exactly what we're doing, the background of the chemicals, why we use them, etc. That does seem to ease folks' minds. We also have, if it's just, an individual or 2 that's on the fence, we have plenty of materials we can provide. We've also just made phone calls and emailed with people who aren't sure and need some convincing. And so if that's a route somebody wants to take, they're welcome to just reach out to us, and we can help kind of be the, I don't want to say mediator, because we're not trying to force anyone to make a decision one way or the other, but we can at least provide information from a professional viewpoint with lots of experience that sometimes helps people feel more comfortable.
Awesome. And can purple loosestrife material be buried and then covered up?
I would not recommend that. I kind of glazed over this particular this slide, but on the disposal slide, I categorized that along with composting a little bit. And invasive species, in burying them, I would normally not do that, simply because some of them can spread from fragments of the plant. If there are the chance of any seeds being on the plant, they'll just regrow. Some plants can be buried once the plant's completely dead. It's been treated and say it's dead stalks of knotweed or Phragmites, then it could be buried. But if it's just loosestrife material that's been just removed, I would more likely bag it and dispose of it in a landfill, or bring it to a landfill with an incinerator. That's another option, burning it. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys, everyone, for the questions, and thank you, Emily, for answering all those. I think that was incredibly helpful for everyone. So now I'm going to pass it off to Patty real quick, who is also with Polls, Patty Hershberger. So I will pull up that PDF to share, and take it away, Patty. Oh, I think you're muted.
How about now?
You're good to
Hi.
go.
All right. I'm Patty Hertzberger. I'm part of the Spider Lake, Runny Lake team that helps organize this Poles educational series we brought to you for 3 years running. We, along with the team at Grand Traverse Conservation District, members of Emily Cook, ISN Outreach Specialist as our speaker, Lauren Silver as moderator, and Irene Stibbets as our community education engagement specialist. And we're all glad that you joined us here today. The cooperative effort between the teams was able to bring to you information on numerous aquatic invasive species and preventative treatment strategies we all need to practice. These practices will help maintain our lakes' waters and associated habitats for a variety of species. Our DNR representative also is part of the team that helps supply us with these signs and pamphlets to help remind people of the importance of washing their boat when it is taken to different bodies of water. You may have seen the signs with the catchphrase, clean all equipment of any plants. This can be right down to even your kayak paddle, or like Lauren was saying, even your shoes and things you might not have even thought of, like your car tires when you have to back up and put your boat in. So these are all things, just anything that might touch the water, clean it off. And then drain your live wells and ballasts of water. We have the live wells from fishermen, and we have many of the wake boats now that do have ballasts that can fill up with water to create a large wave, and those need to be emptied. Dry your boats and equipment, and then disposed of any unwanted bait right in the trash. However, we are most appreciative of you, Team 3, the holders of the health of our homes. Without your call to educate yourself on issues in the environment that are affecting us all, and then act on these issues, there would be a massive trickle-down effect lasting for generations. And to thank Emily for volunteering to be our speaker at the 2021 Poles Lunch and Learn, we will be presenting her with a set of cards like our others. This is by, you might be able to see it, Kristen Herlin. She's in Glen Arbor. And our cards show, these cards show a reflection of the different seasons that you would see around this area. And they are so nice that they are even good enough for framing. So we'll be sending that out with a big thank you. And also registrants of today's program will receive an email just probably in the next few weeks with information on the availability of this recorded event and a link to get to it. And in closing, if you enjoyed today's webinar and gained a new perspective about how invasive species encroach upon our lakes and streams, please consider donating to the Grand Traverse Conservation District. They employ countless individuals and numbers of volunteers who are passionate about the health of the environment and the secondary effects of us all. Their website is another valuable source of information on our lands, waters, and air. I'll hand it back off to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Patty. And yep, as Patty said, keep an eye out for that email with the recording link, and Emily will provide some additional information as pertaining to some of those questions. And I believe you'll also be sharing your slides for the presentation, correct, Emily?
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. And feel free to share any of these recording links and Emily's slides to others that you feel might be interested in these topics. And with that, we will let everybody get back to their day, but thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to the Poles team for putting everything together, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.